All right, good morning. I suggest we start just to keep in the time frame. My name is Jan. I'm from ETH Zurich, presenting work on environmental migration in Bangladesh. If you had a look at the program, you will see that I'm 2 times in there. And so Adrienne suggested to tie both presentations together since they're also from the same project. So I don't need to repeat all the introductory context of the project. So you'll hear me for the next roughly 30 minutes. So basically the title of the 2 papers that I'll present, which are 2 chapters from my dissertation. First one is environmental shocks and migration among climate vulnerable populations in Bangladesh. So this one focuses on mobility, and then second one focuses on immobility and trapped populations, trapped by climate change, linking migration aspirations to actual moves among climate vulnerable populations in Bangladesh. So I think it's also not only logistically reasonable to tie them together, but hopefully there will also emerge a storyline spanning both mobility and immobility questions for this case study region. What is the motivation of our research project? You're all familiar probably with these reports. So in recent years, we've seen increasing interest in both academic and policy spheres in climate migration, especially internal climate migration. Groundswell reports are probably the most prominent example of large-scale projections of climate migration until 2050. However, they have also been criticized methodologically, since they're primarily based on the number of people exposed to certain climate risks, but have only limited account for potential adaptation that might occur. So it's not really clear whether they overestimate numbers. This was a future outlook looking back on what we know empirically from the past. Most empirical evidence that we have so far is either anecdotal, so there have been some studies on the relationship between droughts, migration, and the civil conflict in Syria, or confined to specific case studies. And the large majority of studies actually is derived from aggregated levels of analysis, macro studies, where, for example, a drought that occurs in a certain part of a country is linked to interprovincial migration flows that are obtained from a census, which, however, bears always the danger of ecological fallacy. So even if we observe an increase in migration after a drought, it's hard to prove causally that this was really related to the drought, or there are other factors that are maybe driving this migration. So the challenge really is to create this causal link between environmental changes on the one hand and resulting human migration on the other hand. And so far, I would say that there is insufficient evidence for policymakers to prepare, especially for migration that goes towards cities and affects infrastructure preparations. We need a very good understanding, of course, of what migration flows to expect. So turning towards the first paper, environmental shocks and migration. Summary ahead. The main research question that I address in this work is, what is the causal role of environmental changes in individual level migration decision making? So really looking now at individual and household level decision making. I will specify that in a moment. Contributions. So what I use is a unique panel data set that we are about to compile in Bangladesh. It's still ongoing data collection, which also includes data on migration aspirations, which so far haven't been incorporated in many data collection efforts. We not only look at the binary choice of whether people stay or go, but also at the duration, whether they move permanently or temporarily, and the destination, whether they move to a city or stay in rural contexts. We work with respondents' self-reported affectedness by environmental events rather than objective measures, since a lot of literature by now has shown that in the end, it's perceptions that matter more than what we can objectively measure. And we look at two different types of environmental events, in this case, riverbank erosion and flooding, since also here there's increasing evidence that the link between environmental change and migration depends a lot on the specific type of climatic or environmental change that we look at. Our finding is that I find a strong effect of environmental changes on the migration likelihood, especially for riverbank erosion. And the moves that I observe that are related to the environment are mostly permanent and rural to rural. Theoretically, I based the work on two core frameworks. First of all, Carling et al. Early 2000s established the aspiration ability model, stating that migration will occur if people have a desire to move, but also the ability. So if one of the two is lacking, there will be no mobility. And second, the Foresight project from the British government, Black et al., which also introduced the notion of vulnerability. So stating that in the end, it depends on the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of households to environmental changes. So I combine both frameworks and state that migration depends on first a need to move, so some environmental push factor, plus a desire to move and the ability to move. So if these three come together, then migration will occur. Secondly, I mentioned already that different types of environmental events affect migration in different ways. So what has been found so far is that sudden onset short-term events, such as floods or storms, typically have large immediate impacts on the well-being of affected individuals. For example, they might need to even flee to save their lives. So here we expect a positive effect on the migration likelihood in the short term. But then slow onset or long-term events such as droughts or salinity that come in more creepingly have smaller immediate impacts on well-being, plus typically adaptation is possible. So here we don't expect a significant effect on the migration likelihood. The case that we work on is Bangladesh, one of the countries most exposed to climate change already today. So they have a whole list of environmental events that they're exposed to. We, in this study, focus on riverbank erosion and flooding. Also for migration, it's an interesting case study since historically it's deeply embedded in the country's culture. And also for the future, the groundswell reports that I introduced in the beginning estimate that several million people will most likely migrate internally until 2050 due to environmental changes. A few impressions of what riverbank erosion looks like in our case study region. Since I had not seen such pictures before starting this work, I always imagined riverbank erosion as the river taking small parts of the riverbank and also having this creeping effect. Here it's really large-scale erosion, so whole chunks of soil that get washed away by the river at the onset of the monsoon, mainly in June to August or May to August, and thereby taking whole buildings, taking whole villages within a few weeks. So this upper left building that we see the remains of, it's a primary school that was still functional around 2 weeks before we passed by there. But then, yeah, it's really devastating to see the consequences that it has. Also, to give some more context, it's a progressive event that in those areas that experience massive erosion typically occurs several years in a row. So this is now a satellite-based analysis where we see also the scale. So we see erosion for 6 consecutive years from 2015 to 2019. And we see that each year in this particular place, there have been around 200 to 300 meters eroded. So over 6 years, this is probably up to 1 kilometer that got eroded inland by the monsoon flooding, especially. And maybe I didn't mention in blue, what's seen here is that this has been settlement before. So we see that basically whole villages got eroded here. So as I said, with this project, we try to establish causality between environmental changes and migration, which is statistically challenging because migration is always influenced by many, many different factors. Social factors, economic factors, and environmental factors are then just one set of influences. What we need for that is a counterfactual. I always like to explain it with pharmaceutical studies where you have a treatment group and a control group. The treatment group gets the drug, the control group doesn't, and then you observe both groups over time, and any differences that you see between the two groups can be attributed to the drug. For a natural phenomenon, this is of course a bit more challenging than for a drug study because you cannot assign people to certain groups. So you cannot say you will be affected by erosion and you will not. So this is why it's called quasi-experiment. We needed to sample a set of households that was at a similar risk of being affected by erosion in the upcoming monsoon season. But then who is affected and who's not is beyond our control. It's a natural process. So that's why it's called quasi-experiment. So we sampled a set of households before the monsoon, multi-stage. I will explain in a minute what that means. And then after the monsoon, we went back and we re-interviewed both those who have been affected during the monsoon and those who haven't, and both those who migrated and those who stayed. And given that we did a random sample before the monsoon, we can then causally claim that any differences that we observe between migrants and non-migrants and between affected and non-affected households can be attributed to the erosion process. So that's the statistical idea behind the project. We selected 36 villages that are distributed all along one of the large streams in Bangladesh, the Jamuna River. Within these villages, we sampled households in 3 different zones according to distance from the riverbank to capture different risk levels. So those that live very close to the riverbank, of course, have the highest risk of being affected in the upcoming monsoon season. And then the further you go inland, the lower the risk gets. So these are the 36 villages that I just mentioned. So Jamuna is one of the 3 large streams in Bangladesh coming in from India. You also see in the satellite image, this is a giant river. It's one of the largest braided rivers in the world with about 12 kilometers channel width in total and several channels in between, large islands. We only work on the easternmost outermost riverbank, and then have villages from the Indian border up here down to where it merges with the Ganges. For this research, I use 2 waves from the panel study. It's a longer project. It's 3 years panel study in total, but I only work with 2 waves for this particular sub-project. So first one, wave 1 was pre-monsoon in March to June 2021. Wave 2 is then the post-monsoon survey in January, February 2022 during the dry season after the monsoon. Short overview of which variables I use and how they were measured. So up here is again the overview of the waves with the monsoon season in between. The dependent variables are the migration measures, which are measured post-monsoon by observation. So we first of all measured, have people migrated out of the village or not? But then also if they moved, did they move temporarily or permanently and to a city or to another rural location? Independent variables, now we get back to the theoretical constructs that I mentioned in the beginning. They are operationalized, the need to move as a self-reported affectedness by either erosion or flooding during the previous monsoon season. So this we also asked in the post-monsoon survey, have you been affected in the previous monsoon? And now importantly, and that's probably one of the core advantages that we have with the panel data we have, migration aspirations, which are the proxy for the desire to move, and socioeconomic status, which is a proxy for the ability to move. Those 2 we can now draw from the pre-monsoon survey. So those are measured pre-treatment. Why is that important? Because both of those might otherwise be affected by the erosion impacts. So for example, socioeconomic status might be lower post-monsoon than pre-monsoon if a person lost their land or their house. We also include different control variables that are relevant for migration studies in general. All of these are also measured pre-monsoon for the same reasons that I just mentioned. So coming to the results, this is the core finding. These are now 6 different models, but those are just robustness checks, so I don't introduce all models in detail. In the end, what's shown here is the effect of erosion impact, flood impact, migration aspirations, and socioeconomic status on the migration likelihood. Again, measured on the individual level of the respondents, which are in our case household heads. I forgot to mention that. And we see that it's primarily the erosion impact, which has a statistically significant and also substantively relevant influence. So this increases the migration likelihood by around 0.15, so by 15 percentage points. The baseline migration rate in that area is around 11 percentage points. So among the control group of unaffected households, 11% migrated. Now, those that were affected have an additional 15 percentage points migration likelihood. So it's in the end more than a doubling of the migration likelihood. Flood impacts are insignificant, as are prior migration aspirations. And this is now interesting. It's a tiny effect, but still interesting that socioeconomic status has a negative effect, meaning richer households or participants are less likely to move than poorer ones. Next, I look at moderation effects, specifically of socioeconomic status, since I explained in the theory that it's an interplay of affectedness, but also socioeconomic status, whether migration occurs. So what we see here is the moderating effect of socioeconomic status on the migration likelihood after being affected. And we see that on the left for erosion, we see an increase and also statistically significantly different from 0, which means that richer households after having been affected by erosion are more likely to migrate than poorer ones, which in turn indicates first evidence for trapped populations, because it might mean that poorer households have less means to move after having been affected. For flood affectedness on the right, this effect is insignificant. Next, I subdivide affectedness. So far, we only looked at overall affectedness, yes, no, but we also then followed up in the survey and asked what exactly was the impact. And then this can span a wide range from I lost part of my crops to I lost all my land or I lost my house. So we categorize these impacts that respondents indicated by degree of severity. And we see that it's really as we would expect, the stronger the impacts get, the more so I do 2 presentations together just for your timekeeping. Thanks. The more stronger the impacts get, the more stronger the effect on the migration likelihood is, especially for erosion. Again, this is statistically significantly different from 0. Next, the analysis of migration duration. So now the models are multinomial logit models. So we subdivide whether respondents move temporarily or permanently and have again the same independent variables. What we see is that erosion affectedness affects both permanent and temporary moves significantly, but substantively it's much stronger for permanent moves, whereas temporary moves are then also affected by a low socioeconomic status. And similarly for migration destination, again, multinomial logit models for rural to urban versus rural to rural moves. And similarly, we see that erosion impacts mainly lead to rural moves, whereas rural to urban moves are primarily driven by low socioeconomic status. To sum up the results of this first paper, Erosion effectiveness has a highly significant and strong influence on the migration likelihood, flood effectiveness much less strong, and in most models insignificantly. Results are driven by the type of impact, which is also a potentially relevant finding in terms of policymakers trying to support affected populations. Existing aspirations slightly increase the migration likelihood, but also in most models insignificantly. Higher socioeconomic status decreases the likelihood to move. And lastly, erosion leads to permanent rural to rural moves, whereas temporary moves to cities are more likely for households with low socioeconomic status. So this was now the chapter on mobility. Now we look at those who stay, trapped populations in particular. Where this comes from is from a puzzle that we all know that climate change threatens the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the globe. And yet we observe that most or many actually prefer staying over moving. So the puzzle is, why do actually so many people continue to stay in highly exposed areas? Possible explanations. One that has been probably discussed the most are economic constraints. This is exactly the notion of trapped populations, that people like to go but cannot. But there's an increasing literature that there's also significant non-material factors that tie people to places and that need to be considered when studying immobility. So contributions of the second paper, first of all, I look at how migration aspirations turn into actual moves. And secondly, I try to understand reasons for immobility for our case study region. Thereby, I define two groups. First of all, involuntary non-migrants or trapped populations are people who have been affected by an environmental shock and stay, but who actually had preferred to move. Voluntary non-migrants, on the other hand, also have been affected and stay, but they didn't have a preference for moving a priori. So they actually prefer staying over leaving. And I try to identify these two groups and see what differentiates them. Again, I use the same data set and the same waves. So I'll skip that and directly jump into the results. So again, as shown up here, I use the same two survey waves and compare now basically a cross tabulation of who has moved between wave 1 and wave 2, yes or no, to who had migration aspirations in wave 1, yes or no. So what do I mean by having migration aspirations in wave 1? We basically ask respondents right now, ideally, if you could choose, would you like to stay here or would you like to move away? And then those who said, I would like to move away, they are in the category yes. So we see this is around, what is it, maybe 10% of, or less 8% of the total sample that had aspirations pre-monsoon. And then we see that out of these, around 70 moved, and this is now only permanent moves. So really people who packed their whole household and moved outside the village. For methodological reasons, this is a subgroup. I also have data on temporary migrants, but they are not considered here. That's why this number is rather low. And now this should. Can you otherwise manually? Ah, yeah, perfect. So now we can basically see how many of these two groups moved, and we see that among those who didn't have migration aspirations pre-monsoon, around 4% moved, whereas among those who had aspirations, 8% moved. So this is an indication that migration aspirations that are measured through surveys can actually serve as a proxy for future migration, and they result in higher outmigration afterwards. I will discuss potential policy relevance of this finding in the end. Now coming to the maybe interesting questions in asking, among those who had aspirations, why did some people move and why did others not move? I modeled this statistically, and what we have in here as independent variables are, again, erosion impact, flood impact, socioeconomic status, and then interaction effects of erosion impact and socioeconomic status, and flood impact and socioeconomic status. But what we see is that essentially it's primarily, again, the erosion impact that drives whether aspirations turn into moves. So in other words, people have aspirations a priori, but then whether they actually move depends on whether they get affected or not. And interestingly, socioeconomic status at this stage doesn't play a role. So it's not that only those move who are rich and who have the means to do so. It's really the environmental impact that drives this, this relationship. Coming now to the second research question, determinants of immobility. So again, I do a same cross tabulation of who moved and who had aspirations in wave one, but now taking the subset of those who have been affected by either erosion or floods in the previous monsoon. So assuming that those are now the respondents who would face a physical need to move, they have been hit by the erosion or the flood. Now we see that among the non-migrants, so those who stayed in the village after the erosion occurred, around 82% of these non-migrants actually didn't have migration aspirations pre-monsoon. So they would be classified as voluntary non-migrants. They have been affected, they stayed, but they also didn't want to move. Whereas the resulting 18%, they have been affected and they stayed, but they actually preferred moving. So these would be classified as involuntary non-migrants. And now again, I model what differentiates the two groups. So as dependent variable, there's a binary indicator of whether immobility is involuntary or voluntary. And I see that it's, in the end, the only thing that's consistently, or except for the last model, but this is a separate story, let's say at least for the first two models, consistently significant is socioeconomic status, where lower socioeconomic status means a higher likelihood to be an involuntary migrant. So in other words, poorer people are more likely to be involuntary non-migrants than richer ones. And this now is exactly the storyline of PrEP populations, indicating that it's the lack of resources that leads to involuntary immobility. I contrast this. This has now been the statistical analysis, but also in the survey, we directly asked those people who had indicated pre-monsoon that they would like to move, but then they didn't. We asked them, why did you actually stay in the village? And this is now ranked by frequency, and we see basically a very similar storyline to what I just showed statistically. So the first most important reason is erosion hasn't occurred yet. So people really wait for erosion to occur. But then we also have economic reasons like lack of money to move or to pay for expenses in other places that respondents indicate for reasons not to move. All right, so I'll jump to the overall conclusions of these two papers. In the study, we overall find a high propensity to migrate, focusing on only one single monsoon season. We've just in a different session talked about compound effects. So if we now extrapolate this and consider that monsoon occurs every year in Bangladesh, this might result in considerable absolute numbers of migrants. But still, even in a scenario of these extreme environmental changes, many people prefer to stay where they are. And permanent moves seem to occur mostly as a last resort and are short distance. So in this settings, it appears quintessential to investigate who likes to stay, who likes to go, from a policy perspective that tries to support people in what they want, rather than thinking about forced or planned relocations that might face fierce resistance if people's preferences are not considered. So basically support for voluntary non-migrants would then be helping to adapt in situ, whereas support for involuntary non-migrants would be reducing barriers to migration. So it's very different policy responses that result for these two groups of immobile populations. So with this, thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussions later on.
Thank you for your presentation, and I would like to introduce our virtual speaker, who is Harald Sterly, here with us. So Harald, I present you, and you may begin.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. So I share my screen. Let me just start the presentation and share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Great. So let me thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to present also remotely, and thanks also Jan for this really interesting insights into the research in Bangladesh. I'm taking you on a little bit different pathway of thinking through that. I'm talking now about the differentiation of migration as adaptation and how we need to, or what we need to do to disentangle the often very one-sided approaches or conflated imaginaries or presentations and discourses we see on that. My starting point is that when talking about the opportunities or options for migration as adaptation, we often see a rather dichotomous view between either, I would say, almost enthusiasm towards migration as adaptation, or a very pessimistic perspective on migration being a sign of maladaptation or leading to maladaptation. And after the increasing recognition of the idea of migration, of adaptation, also after the Freihardt report that's been quite a while now, the IPCC in its last report again took that up and had the statement, for example, that under conditions of voluntary and planned movements, migration has the potential to contribute to migration. But we also have ample evidence of migration as erosive, as contributing rather to negative social, economic, health, etc. Outcomes. If we go through literature, we can see that there is quite limited evidence that systematically disentangles to what degree and under what conditions exactly and for whom migration does really contribute to adaptation, and where limitations towards that are and under what conditions that does not apply. So what we are calling for here in this contribution is a rather context-specific view, but also one that takes into account the complexity of migration outcomes and the different outcomes in dimensions such as health, social, economic, or cultural, demography, and in different spatial, social, and temporal scales. So what does that mean? Our idea, or the conceptual approach that we want to bring forward, is rather than talking about the binary view of migration as adaptation or not, looking at a more continuous view on different dimensions and scales of translocal social resilience, that's how we call it. The idea is that migration is a part of local and translocal livelihoods in many parts of the world where people move, and these movements contribute to the establishment of dense translocal networks that connected different places of origin and several places of destination, flows of financial remittances, of skills, knowledge, people, perspective, worldviews, aspirations, etc. And these, of course, are not only transforming livelihoods and influencing people's livelihoods, but also have at least the potential to influence, increase the social resilience and adaptive capacity of rural communities. But, and that's not a but, to have a better view on under what conditions, with what mechanisms, and for whom that applies, what we need to do is we need to reconsider the unit of analysis from spatially bounded households and communities in either rural or urban, or let's say either origin or destination places, and see these as translocally connected, translocally situated livelihood formations that function at least to a certain degree together. Decision-making of investments, of further migration prospects or activities, etc., often work along these translocally situated household constellations. At the same time, we need to consider both migrants and non-migrant parts of households or families as embedded in destination and origin social ecological systems, taking into account the different spatial and temporal dynamics and scales how origin and destination places and their social and ecological systems function. And this is important, we need to see livelihoods pathways as results of the interplay of both very unequal structural properties, wealth, gender, age, language, etc., pp., and human agency, practices and strategies. So that's the conceptual background. So the idea is here to better understand the very, let's say, patchy and fine-grained impacts and outcomes of migration. We need to disentangle them along the spatiality, to see the origin, the destination, and the connectivity between these two. Along social scales, we need to see the intersectional differences between individual, household, social groups, community. In our empirical work, it was especially individual and households, how different individuals and households within communities, within social groups, very unequally benefit and bear costs of migration and mobility. And of course, the different dimensions. I mentioned that social, that's separation and social benefits, peer groups, loss of connectivity. Of these economic, obviously, financial remittances play an important role here. Health, social or cultural, demography, and also ecological impacts of remittances and of migration, how this transforms places. But also the time horizon. There are very differential impacts and outcomes of migration and mobility on the short, on this maybe seasonal, if it happens in a seasonal way, or in the long-term dimension or in long-term perspective. Consider social ecological systems and their transformations through incoming remittances and land use change that can have a very beneficial economic outcome in the short term and a detrimental ecological outcome in the long term, right? So that's what we need to disentangle to really grasp the outcomes of migration. Very briefly, I will undergird this now with a little bit of empirical examples from a project that took place a while ago, 5 years of research in the setting of northeast and northern Thailand, in places that were specifically selected for their vulnerability and exposure to various slow and sudden onset climate events. So for rural origin areas, domestic destination areas, especially in the urban, larger urban area of Bangkok, but also internationally in Singapore and Germany. Just some key ideas. So what are mechanisms? Just a good example is how migration facilitates agricultural innovation, but also specifically adaptation to climate change. So what we found is a number of examples how migration and translocal knowledge and financial flows contributed to innovation and adaptation. For example, different agricultural practices like cutting of rice when it has a certain height to limit the growth of weeds and to reduce the need for pesticides. Broadcasting instead of transplanting rice to adapt to variability of rainfall and to failures of crops in the beginning of the growing season. It's much easier to broadcast rice again than to transplant again, right? But also organic farming and shifting towards sustainable land use practices that have been brought in by returning migrants from urban areas. So what does migration do here? It enables, of course, investments. Any kind of adaptation is a change, and that's always risk for smallholder farmers, but also new ideas and perspective and aspirations to do something differently. So it's the combination of financial remittances and knowledge and skills transfers in specific ways that are really success factors for turning migration into adaptive strategy. One really important thing is the situation of migrants at the places of destination. If we look at Singapore, where most migrants, Thai migrants that was a bit past, but no migrants from Bangladesh and other places as well, suffer from a very strong and strategic structural segregation within the larger Singaporean society, being almost confined to camp areas where they work and have to live, and kept in a status of permanent temporariness that limits their embedding in the local Singaporean context, and that forces basically a very strong orientation towards home. That meant for the Thai migrants in Singapore that, especially compared to other international destinations, there was a very stable and high flow of remittances towards home areas, towards home places. So briefly, what we have, if we have a look at how benefits and costs of migration are distributed, and we see the different scale, household and migrant, or household and individual, and migrant and or place of destination, place of origin. If we disentangle that and try to find different types of outcomes, we can say on these two axes, household resilience increased, or benefits from migration decreased, or the migrants' resilience or well-being decreased or increased, so benefits or bears more costs. So what we find is that this is very differentially distributed. We have a prevalence, I would say, at least in this Thai example, of something like we call precarious resilience, where the household benefited on the back of the costs of the well-being of the migrants, and something like translocal insecurities, where both sides lose through migration. We also have something like sustainable gains, right, where the household can turn migration and remittances to really long-term adaptive pathways, and the migrants themselves also benefit through better education, access to opportunities in destination areas, and or upon return and take over this functioning household in the place of origin. So key things that determine where a household might end up in this very differential outcome scenario are the household's basic wealth before migration. If a household is better able to invest remittances productively, that is a very strong determinant way and up, but also the migrants' position and job in places of destination. So what we have here is a very differential pathways either towards a long-lasting improvement, or, and this is more often the case, the reproduction of existing inequalities and vulnerability and precarity. So the key message that we can deliver from our research and this framework here, yes, migration obviously has the potential to support adaptation to climate change and to other risks as well. But these outcomes of migration are very unequal, and they differ by place and social scale. And it's important to understand these differences and avoid the conflation of these to come to conclusions like generalized migration outcomes, because this is basically rendering actors, and most likely vulnerable actors, and their differences invisible or invisible. Key influencing factors where people end up in this constellation, or in this outcome types, are basically the constellation of conditions in origin and destination and the migration mode. So how far migration was happening in a planned way, or how large the degree of choice for migration was. But, and that's the bottom line, I think migration tends to reproduce existing inequalities on household, but also on the community level. I think it's important to consider migration outcomes also beyond this adaptive capacity. So remittances can be invested in something, and also to consider the vulnerability context and the drivers of vulnerability. And this is inequality, but also that's when we talk about the long-term stuff on the temporal dimension, demography of places of especially origin, but also destination, the regional, local or regional, social, economic, and ecological context, etc. So I think in the policy level, that's my last slide, how to make migration work for adaptation. I think it is important to strengthen the capacity of especially the most vulnerable to adapt in either places of adaptation, of destination origin, but especially to increase the freedom of choice to decide or to move or to stay, to avoid displacement and migration that happens in modes that are unplanned and unstrategic. I think we should acknowledge the potential of migration for adaptation, so decrease obstacles, and that comes often to policies of rural development, of incentivizing or disincentivizing migration and incentivizing stays in a more pushy way. And focus on working and living conditions of migrants in places of destination, because that's a key determinant of enabling people to really make a difference in their translocal livelihood constellations. But also we should avoid something we could call neoliberal traps, putting the adaptation burden on the shoulders of migrants who are in many cases those who are the most vulnerable, and see that migration needs to be or should be an interplay of planned adaptation that is strongly supported by the state and other larger actors, where climate justice questions also come in. But on the other hand, also see autonomous adaptation and the agency of people and migrants as a valuable contribution to climate resilient development pathways. Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, looking forward to any questions, but I think we do this in the second part, right?
Are you introducing me? Should I introduce myself?
So good morning, everyone. My name is Juliette Budge, and I'm from Waimea on the island of Hawaii. Elevation of my island that I'm from is 13,000 and about 700 feet. So sea level rise for us won't be as big of a problem. I'm actually a researcher at the University of Hawaii, Manoa with the Climate Resilience Collaborative. My research group creates high resolution digital elevations of islands and then models sea level rise and inundation. And we use these to educate and help inform policy decisions. I actually have one of my coworkers here, Aloha. She does a lot of this modeling for us. So today, actually, I'm not going to be, is the volume okay? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to be discussing that as much. I'm going to share a portion of my PhD research that focuses on an agreement called the Compact of Free Association, or COFA, and more broadly, what borderless migration can teach us about future movements of people in response to climate change. This research included fieldwork in Micronesia and Hawaii, over 200 interviews and qualitative data analysis of the local newspaper in Hawaii to understand the politics of reception there, as well as neighborhood board meetings that the migrants lived in, the receiving communities, to understand more about how placemaking was happening at a very local level. I thought that I would start by sharing a few images of the modeling that we do. The clicker, okay. Okay, so this is a draft of our new sea level rise viewer, and it's showing a neighborhood that's pretty well known in Hawaii. Anyone recognize this area? Waikiki, sound familiar? Okay, so this is Waikiki at 2 feet of sea level rise. We do have a time associated, intermediate and intermediate high is what we use, but I'm pulling this up just to show kind of the threat to a place. So this is at 10 feet, which we all recognize as a very extreme sea level rise, but Waikiki completely goes underwater. So I wanted to show these just as the seriousness that places are facing, especially shorelines, and even more than that, islands. Which brings us to Oceania. Who is familiar with this region in the world? Okay, great. So Oceania is a vast area. Micronesia is more specifically where I'm going to be focusing on. It includes approximately 2,100 islands and atolls with a total land area of about 1,000 square miles. The ocean that's encompassed in this area is 3 million square miles. So that's about as large as the contiguous United States. So it's a huge space. This vast expanse has many different cultures and nations. It's not defined by one language and instead has geographic, linguistic, and cultural differences. While the future outcomes for many island nations cannot be fully predicted, there's some impacts which are already being felt. There's already an increased frequency of major weather events impacting communities in Oceania. So here's a map of Micronesia, and you can see the Marshall Islands. And this is an area, one of the islands known as Kwajalein. So for example, high water events that used to only occur once a year on average in the 1960s occurred 22 times a year on average during the decade starting in 2005. So imagine that you live on one of these islands, the sea is all around you, ocean continually lapping your shores. When big storms happen, there can be total overwash events which salinate the freshwater table. And this is the reality for many inhabitants in Oceania. So I don't think we should try to predict how many people might have to move or be salinated, but I think we should consider what solutions there are to deal with this very complex issue. For centuries, atoll islanders have diversified their livelihoods by migration. Islanders themselves and colonial and post-colonial authorities recognize migration and resettlement as a means of alleviating poverty and food insecurity, and formal resettlement schemes were sometimes put into place. The first people to arrive in the islands are thought to have come from Southeast Asia around 2,000 years ago. There are many different accounts of this early history, but there's general consensus that the early settlers were voyagers on an epic scale. For these oceanic people, colonizing new territories and across vast distances was common, and mobility was a foundational aspect of their culture. While many people associate non-instrument wayfinding with Hawaiians and today the hokulea, navigational skills and the highly specialized craft of building sailing vessels were prevalent across Oceania. It was Papa Mau, a navigator from the Marshall Islands and Micronesia, specifically his island was Satawal, who mentored Nainoa Thompson and the rebirth of Polynesian navigating. Mau successfully navigated the first voyage of the hokulea between Hawaii and Tahiti in 1976. This inaugural trip proved that intentional two-way voyaging was possible and that it was a likely explanation of migration and settlement in Oceania. But the story of migration for Micronesians began the more modern story by their forced removal due to US nuclear testing. In 1944, at the end of World War II, the United States captured the islands from the Japanese. They forced islanders and the Marshalls to relocate and then detonated nuclear bombs, so many that they equate to 72 times the amount, 1,000 times the amount that was dropped during Hiroshima. While the nuclear history is only one aspect of the compact agreements, it is an important one because of the homeland for the Marshallese people was entirely destroyed. And I think we can see similarities between what happened in this part of history and the future with climate change and sea level rise. While Oceania lives are already immeasurably impacted by climate change, a phenomenon created by nations and industries far away from their island shores. Without interventions like island building, their homes and land may disappear completely. And yet the US and other nations responsible for this environmental crisis have done nothing substantive to address the likely necessity of their movement. Even at the lowest sea level rise scenarios, the impacts are massive. And beyond the total loss of home, many other places no longer have potable water due to the saltwater intrusion. And despite migration being considered as a choice, any island nation or person or government will explain that it's not a first choice. People do not want to leave their homes. Part of the explanation lies in that the customary land is inseparable from those who care for it. In Oceania, many people's very identity, their ancestral connection, their livelihood, and their community is founded in their land. As Josie Howard, a program director for the We Are Oceania, told me, I'm concerned all the time about how it affects us and what will happen in the future and our culture and the land. You can see that despite the navigation and mobility being a historic adaptation response, it's not without its complications. Current policies of COFA around migration, the Compact of Free Association, might be able to help us better prepare for the likely increase in human movement in Oceania. These agreements are between the United States and the federally associated states, which are the Republic of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. The compact allows for freely associated states to have a degree of autonomy in their choice to move. They also receive subsidies. These agreements make it possible for people to migrate to the US without having to go through the Naturalization Immigration Service. Thus, the term migrant is used instead of immigrant. Migrants are able to work, attend school, and legally function in many ways in the United States as a normal US citizen, including paying taxes. In exchange for this, the access and some economic and development support in the islands. The agreement gives the US exclusive military rights for this 3 million square mile space. So this research that I did really explored the dynamics around COFA migration, because as a policy for human movement, it's an example of a more porous way between the US and these compact states. This gives migrants more agency in making decisions around their mobility. Like other migrants, COFA migrants move based on multiple variables, including healthcare, education, employment, and environmental pressures. Unlike other unauthorized or under-authorized immigrants who may be banned from conventional mobility channels, the employment opportunities, COFA migrants have expanded access, though they are limited in access to healthcare and access to Social Security, despite, as I mentioned earlier, paying taxes. These limitations to their access can be seen as structural discrimination and should be addressed in future compacts around migration. However, I think COFA is still a positive example for migration because unauthorized immigrants are often forced to use unorthodox means of self-affirmation and survival, which do not successfully help them integrate into their new receiving communities. Using the COFA as a proxy is supported by the fact that the United Nations in 2018 introduced its Global Compact for Migration, which recognizes the outsized influence migration has and will continue to have. The UN Global Compact states that there are over 260 million migrants around the world living outside of their country of birth. And the number is expected to grow for reasons including population growth, increasing connectivity, trade, rising inequality, and climate change. While organizations around the world are awakening to this reality, there's still much work to do. In 2018, Fiji published its relocation guidelines that provided a framework for climate change and related movement. It discusses how people, as a last resort, will move internally and eventually across borders. Fiji is one of the first nation states to develop a national framework that guides the relocation process, making this document quite extraordinary. It is indicative of what lays ahead, and it covers some aspects of international migration and even the discussions around receiving communities. The Fijian government is proactively thinking about movement, and this is the preferred approach as reactive movement is devastating for the communities. A whole of society approach can ensure the responsibility for managing migration is shared by local, national, regional, civic, private, and government sectors. There's a massive need for greater awareness of the experiences of Pacific diaspora in communities receiving migrants from Oceania and improving efforts at building cohesive communities that support each other in the face of changing demographics that result from migration. The challenges and opportunities of migration should be uniting nations and communities rather than dividing them. COFA migrants are the best proxy for future immigrants, policies that address climate change migrants globally. The issues that are uncovered in this research are deep and wide. However, solutions are visible, and knowledge about COFA and what worked well and what didn't should become markers in a quickly approaching landscape of unknowns. The outcomes of successful integration include economic independence, less reliance on state and federal funding, increased cultural understanding, less stereotyping, recognition of difference, and more cultural expression, and the right to space in receiving communities. The social impacts of shunning and effectively segregating migrants, which has happened to Micronesians in Hawaii, are both economically and culturally damaging to the migrants and detrimental to the social and economic well-being of the entire community. The erosion of culture is not an acceptable impact of climate change, and if migration is necessary, migrants need to have space to maintain their traditional practices like their language, culinary preferences, and communal activities. In Hawaii, one coping strategy that I saw with migrants was making themselves invisible, like no longer wearing their traditional clothing or eating their traditional foods to fit in. This strategy was implemented to avoid poor treatment in the receiving community, but it has the effect of rapidly dismantling the migrants' culture and traditions. A shift has to happen. Reimagining and planning for a greater number of migrants in Hawaii and other global destinations will allow for maximum agency for those who choose to move. The risk of rising seas is real. Mitigation, of course, I'm not saying shouldn't be happening, it should be, but I also think we should focus on the process of migration. Importantly, Indigenous knowledge of migrants has a place in the conversation, and COFA migrants are a window into these policies and how they could work. We can observe and learn the migrants' cultures and values and leverage them for maximum mutual benefit for migrants and the communities they choose to settle in. A vastly more positive politics of reception need to be nurtured. Looking forward, COFA is up for renegotiation this year, and the federal government, the state of Hawaii, and the city and county of Honolulu, I would argue, can improve their strategies for welcoming new migrants should they decide to relocate. Also evident is that despite the lack of a welcoming politics of reception and very limited rights to the city, COFA migrants are still making a home, educating their children, working on becoming part of the community. This shows that there's great value in the migrants' current networks and the maintenance of their culture. More can be done to support the newest members of the Hawaii community, both now and for possible climate change migration in the future. So I'll just end with saying that in Oceania, the islands are separated by sea, but the future is shared, and efforts at placemaking should have embraced that end. Thank you. And one more thing, this book was just published, and I thought possibly we could play a quick little game. Does anyone, know, I'm going to choose an island, my favorite island that I actually got to live on for a year. And they're really amazing navigators. And the island spans 4 hemispheres, all 4 hemispheres. Anyone yet? Not yet. Average elevation is 6.5 feet. No. The most populated island has a density of Hong Kong and Tokyo. No. Say that? Oh, good guess. No, but very close. One island in the group was found by Columbus apparently on Christmas, and so he named it Christmas Island. Yeah, you got it. So this book is by Christina Gerhardt, and it's called Sea Change and Atlas Island.
Thank you. Let me see if I can navigate this. Thank you. That was such a great, I feel like, lead up to my presentation. There's been a lot of kind of connections already. How can I go back here? Okay, so my name is Sarah Rosengaertner. I work with the Global Center for Climate Mobility. We're a new found entity linked to the United Nations. And I'll speak a little bit about our work, but really want to tie it to the question on the table today, or I guess it was a statement here rather than a question: migration as adaptation or maladaptation. And I'll use some of our findings to reflect on this question. This is rehashing a lot of the things that have been said already here in the session and during this conference. And that is just to say, I think we have quite a lot of what I would consider consensus emerging from the research. There are obviously questions open, but I think over and over again, when you listen to presentations on how climate affects human movement, will come away with similar findings that relate to climate not being the only driver, but a multiplier or an effect that acts on the traditional drivers of migration, if you will, that we have a hard time of kind of drawing a line between, is this forced or voluntary movement? Often it's something in between. That there's different patterns of movement, often linked to what kind of impact people are experiencing, and that often influences whether they move more temporarily or longer term. And importantly, this was highlighted by earlier presentations, this whole question of like, how does climate interact with the ability of people to move? Does it actually drive movement, or will it suppress movement in some instances? Again, like I think we have quite a bit of evidence that depending on context, it can do either, and depending on the profile of the people involved. So the most vulnerable may not necessarily be able to move. People who are moving may be landing in areas of greater risk. And most of the movements are actually relatively short distance, not necessarily long distance international migration. So I think all of this we kind of know. When it comes to the question of the session today, well, how does migration relate to adaptation? I think if we take this simply as an empirical question, we actually have very little clarity. And that starts with the fact that we don't have a clear understanding of how we would evaluate adaptation outcomes. There's no agreed definition of what it means to be adapted. There are some, I think, conceptual proposals around, like, we look at exposure, we look at sensitivity, we look at adaptive capacity. But at the end of the day, again, like, it's very difficult to say, well, when is migration an adaptive, when does it have an adaptive success at its end? We don't have clear criteria yet. And what types of movement would be more associated with successful adaptation? I think also still question mark around that. For whom do we assess those outcomes? For the people who move, for the communities of origin, like Harald was presenting, some of the benefits that accrue through remittances and other forms of transfers. Or do we look at the receiving communities and whether they're actually better off with these people arriving? And then over what time frame? I think Lisa Dale this morning in the Africa session really nicely spoke about these kind of intergenerational effects. And so I also think it's very difficult to say, can we already speak about maladaptation? Because my sense is we haven't even done adaptation in earnest. So it seems very early to already speak about maladaptation. But I think all these questions are still open. I will speak about our findings from this initiative and then try to make some argument around why we should maybe consider this question of migration as adaptation less as an empirical and more as a normative question. So we've been working for the last 2 years on an initiative called the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, which is now in its second phase. We are starting similar work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we have an ongoing effort in the Pacific, working with Tuvalu and other atoll nations, very much along the lines that you were reflecting on. But so this work was really an effort to say we need to bring climate mobility as a cross-cutting agenda. Nobody at the moment owns this issue. There's disaster reduction people, disaster management people, there's the climate people, there are development people, there are the migration and the refugee people, but nobody really owns this issue. So how do we bring them all together? And then also, how do we start a process that connects different levels of governance? So we start at the regional level, we anchor ourselves with regional organizations, in this case, the African Union Commission, and we bring the different partners around the table and start with evidence. So we worked with Columbia University colleagues from Season. I'll present some of those findings. We worked with the Mixed Migration Center to kind of ground the modeling that we did in some of the evidence on what's happening right now and some of the narratives that are coming from affected communities. And we put that to a pretty extensive consultation process to understand better our results through the eyes of different people with different backgrounds from the continent, international experts, different levels of government, with the idea of generating a common agenda for action. And then what we're now doing in a second phase, taking that down to the country level. So looking with individual countries, what does this mean for you? How do we bring the modeling, the research down to the impacts in a specific geography, with the ultimate aim of pinpointing the areas that will be most affected and where we can drive partnerships to actually get to implementation of projects, programs on the ground, while at the same time using the fact that we mobilized a broad array of stakeholders to also frame joint messaging for international processes and eventually connect countries that we're working with across regions to form a cross-regional coalition in international policy processes. So we're trying to really work both from the regional level down and from the regional level up. I'll start with our findings on Africa and with this question of like, can we look at migration as adaptation? We did research, the Mixed Migration Center did research for us in 7 places across the continent, rural and urban areas exposed to different kinds of climate-related shocks and stressors, and a different kind of set of livelihoods and cultures. They used the capabilities and aspirations framework that was referred to earlier. So both kind of exploring people's desire to move, but also their assessment of their ability to move. And what we found is that for most of the people, moving was not a preferred option, and it was not considered really an adaptation strategy, right? Like they were not thinking about moving as their first go-to when they were thinking about how to adapt. When they were thinking about how to adapt, it was like changing their way of making a living, eating less, working more, but it was not necessarily moving. But then we had also a quarter almost of people that said, yeah, we would have the desire to move, but we don't have the means to move. So they for themselves ruled that out as an accessible options for themselves. We found that, and this is consistent with some of the findings presented earlier, in terms of the motivations, if people were asked, what are the main motivations for them to want to move, it was mostly economic and livelihood-related factors, but in the places where you had more recent, more extreme effects, or maybe more frequent, like repeated impacts, the environmental or climate factors came out stronger, right? So Beira, which was hit by cyclones, 86% said, this, like our desire to move is clearly related to this. Similarly, in Malawi and Angola, where there was, Malawi actually had like both kind of like flooding and drought, and in Angola, it was also kind of like this combination of effects. People were also saying, more often, this is a reason for us to want to move. And if we're looking at who moves, we saw a greater willingness to move among the young than the older, a greater willingness to move among men than women, and the more educated. I think all these are not surprising findings. But I think if we're thinking about it as in terms of like migration or movement as an adaptation, it tells us something about the demographics that would probably not be part of that, which is the elderly, children, and more often women than men. For our future projections, we modeled different scenarios using a very similar model to the one that was used for the groundswell reports, with some more climate impacts baked into the model and a slightly different population roster from the outset, but it was a similar approach in terms of like a gravity model that distributes population across geography based on climate impacts affecting the attractiveness of places vis-a-vis each other. And we looked at different future scenarios. And what we found is a projected increase of people on the move. So even though people primarily have no desire to move, or a majority of people had no desire to move, the projections suggest that more people will be on the move. I think earlier it was mentioned that there are obviously questions around how accurately are these models predicting the future. But I think they give us an indication of some of the pressures that will be acting on people and countries. And so we see here, this is for internal movement, so people moving within their countries, a projected increase that could reach up to 113 million people. I think the most likely scenario is covered up by my little photo here, but it was more around 87 million people. And if we're looking at it again as a question of adaptation, it's obviously important that you consider where these people go. This is what is called the hotspots area. So it's a map that shows the areas that are most likely to see people leave, which are here in red, and the areas that are most likely to see people come in, which are the green areas. And again, it's mostly people going from one part of the country to another. We see a lot of action around some of the borderlands, Sahel zone, coastal areas that we all know, will have a lot of climate risk, even if people are still forecast to be there. And this is the case for cities. So if we look at the effect of climate mobility, that the contribution it has to the growth of urban areas, you can see that especially in the Horn of Africa, but also around the Lake Victoria, in the Lake Victoria region, here on the Mozambican coast, and further up in Northern Africa, that the impact of climate mobility on the growth of cities is projected to be quite significant. I think we know that the conditions for that urban growth are not ideal, to be polite. So, and we also know that the cities that are forecast to see that growth in population at the same time also are vulnerable to climate impacts. So you have urban areas growing that will also see people move out because of climate impacts. So Lagos, for example, is forecast to see people leave, but overall the city of Lagos is still going to grow. And so a net effect is that you have more people at risk. And I think this leaves us with a question of I think this is covered up, but there's, I think, no automaticity to migration being an adaptation, if having an adaptive function or functioning as an adaptation strategy. If we look at simply kind of what's happening, what are people doing spontaneously, what are the projected trends, I don't think as an empirical matter we could say, yes, migration is going to be an adaptation strategy for anybody. So the question is very much, do we want mobility to be an adaptation strategy? Do we want it to be more than loss and damage? Or do we want it to be more adaptation than loss and damage? Because I don't think it's a fully either or. And if that's the case, then I do think it's less of a question of can we find out through research whether migration functions as adaptation? And as Harald said, put the burden on the migrants to make adaptation happen. And it's more a question of what do we need to do to actually make it possible for people to move in such a manner that it is adaptive. And I think that's a very different ballgame. What would that look like from our perspective? And I think this dovetails with the conclusions presented by earlier presenters here, but is maybe framed a little differently. And that is, I think for communities, it's a little bit of a trap to maybe make it all about staying versus moving. Ultimately, some of those decisions will have to be made. But I think it discounts the fact that even staying will probably involve a tremendous amount of change. So if we have a conversation around loss and damage, I think it's simplistic to say, well, displacement is loss and staying is non-loss. Everything will involve loss. And so I think the question of like, how do you help communities craft what we call adaptation journeys, which may involve staying, moving at a later point, some people moving, other people staying, maybe everybody having to move. But basically looking at this not as an either or, but as a kind of and that loss will probably be part of the process of adaptation. But again, with this intergenerational notion of the next generation may benefit, which I think has always been part of migration, but is, getting more currency now that maybe it affects the global north more. I don't know, but basically, I think, it's always been part of the migration story. On the government side, I think if we look at current assessments of, what are governments saying in their strategies for adaptation, what are they saying in their strategies for migration, it's not, we're still with the sedentary bias, right? Like adaptation means keeping people where they are, supporting them in situ. So if we want to get to a kind of migration as adaptation approach, I think we do need to help governments to anticipate, and that requires probably working further on modeling, trying to refine that, capture more of the complexities of decision-making processes, supporting planning, but also I think, as Harald laid out, this idea of translocality, not just across borders, but also across rural and urban areas, across rural and rural areas. So understanding, how do social safety nets have to function if households are distributed across different places, for example. And then on the international side, so much of the discourse around climate mobility and migration is still on the humanitarian and protection side, which I'm not saying is not needed, but again, like we need to, I think, get to a more preventive place where it's not about like giving people protection once they're in a humanitarian emergency, but how do we create partnerships that actually help people move? The OECD is getting into territory where everybody's scrambling for work. People need labor, but that labor needs to come with skills. There's ideas for skills partnerships. I'm not saying that's the only way out, but I do think that really this thinking about like, how do we create workforces for the future in regions that are highly vulnerable to climate change? What does a resilience workforce look like? How can that jointly be built at a regional level? But also, what is the role for international partners to support that and to open up opportunities for migration? None of that is a silver bullet, but I do think it moves us in the direction of more prevention and less kind of accepting that this is going to be a huge humanitarian crisis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'm going to start the Q&A portion of the session. So please welcome the panelists to the center. So may you welcome me to the center, please. Yes, over there. You may feel free to walk up to the center with the microphone.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I very much enjoyed it. My question is for Sarah. I have two questions. So you showed the map that reflected the borderline areas as hotspots. Are there any further insights to perhaps like North Africa? What that mobility will look like? Are people going to move inland, or is there going to be the likelihood of like movement through the Mediterranean to Europe. So is that something that was observed, perhaps maybe in your interviews in Morocco? And then the second question is about cities. So, you know, cities, in the way you showed it, would lose or gain populations. But as you may already know, a lot of these agreements and negotiations happen at the national level. You also mentioned the regional level in terms of engagement. Where does that place city leadership in terms of amplifying climate mobility and addressing climate mobility, given the restrictions that they have in terms of actually negotiating or implementing policies at that scale? So perhaps you have insights to those questions.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Susan, for those questions. On the first one, the borderlands. So we did not model movements out of the continent. We only modeled movement within Africa, both within countries and across borders, but within the continent. I think you have some countries like Morocco, for example, just within Morocco, because demographic growth is not happening as in some other African countries. And so what you see is like a pretty dramatic shift forecast within the country, people moving north, basically, from the south of the country. Does that translate into more movement into Europe? I mean, I think we know that migration is often based on existing connections between people, right? And so I would imagine that we will see more movement into Europe, but we have no projections or numbers to base that on, right? But I think that once you have certain routes that are established and you have, you know, entrepreneurs around that, but also just family links and people who can pay for others to come, those will be used, I'm sure. And that's the same story in the US and Central America. I think for the second question, I mean, I've worked quite a bit on this question of city leadership, and I think they have a power in numbers. So I think all these efforts of like getting cities and mayors together to make themselves heard in multilateral processes are really bearing fruit. I think there is actually from national governments increasingly an interest to have them at the table because they're scrambling for seeing progress on things that have been agreed. So if you look at the LA Declaration, again, that was done in the Americas, they just had a summit with city leaders. And I think it was very much also with this view of like, who can we rely on to actually make things happen when we're in a political situation where things are very tense and difficult to move. So I would expect next year, when there's going to be a summit on the future of multilateralism at the UN, that cities will make a very strong pitch to have a larger voice in that context. I don't know how far they will get, but I do think that they will probably make progress to some extent. I'm not expecting them necessarily to sit at the same table as heads of state, but I'm sure that there will be a strong push around kind of having a multilateralism that's more multi-stakeholder.
Hi, thank you for this really interesting set of papers. My question is for the first two papers, which were the more empirical research papers. And in both Jan and Harald's papers, you talked about socioeconomic status, but I didn't hear you talk very much about land and land tenure systems and governance and how that would have affected people's migration decisions. And I think that that's I think that that's really important for influencing whether or not people stay or go, is whether or not they feel like they need to maintain their relationship to that land as well as their livelihood. But I actually think that this question of relationship to land could be broader and could apply for everybody's talks today, because I think the question of the Pacific Islands and COFO and, is really interesting because it's about shrinking land. And so I'd be interested to hear your reflection also in Africa on how the loss of arable land is contributing to people's migration decision-making, where they might be, there are different conditions where, where the loss of land is that main driver. So that's my question, is about people and their relationship to land. And I also want to add one more comment, which is that I really appreciate the way in which the empirical papers presented here talked about migration and the climate change as having a marginal effect on migration. And I think that's something that's really important to incorporate into all of our conversations about migration and climate change, because we can't forget that the same drivers of migration that have existed all along and that have been contributing to global urbanization are still in play, and that those are not all necessarily climate related. So we can't forget that as we have these discussions.
Any more questions?
Okay, thanks a lot. I will start and then you can add. For Bangladesh, I think this is a very context-specific question, so I can just share the Bangladesh context, and I guess maybe there's different answers for the other geographical contexts. So yes, it is the key factor is land ownership in Bangladesh. It's a very densely populated country where land is a scarce resource. So this is one of the reasons why people stick around and move short distance, because they still have connection to the land, which is not only economic connection, it's also a spiritual connection to ancestors' land, to ancestors' graves, etc. Plus, what is very particular about this river system is that it erodes a lot of land, but it also creates new land, because it cannot transport all that sediment to the sea. So there's new islands forming. And then there's a local system of redistributing this emerging land among those who have lost land previously. So people have an incentive to stay in the vicinity and speculate that in the future there will be land that's emerging again. So there's a very tight connection to land that regulates this whole mobility dynamic that we observe. And yes, so far we only have it as one component in this. I mean, land ownership is part of socioeconomic status that I showed. But I agree that we also need to discuss this more broadly and more qualitatively in our work. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
I think similar to what you've said about the connection to land, especially in places like Micronesia, where Chuk, for example, it's a matrilineal land management system, and their dominant type of migration is circular. I think I had it on a slide where they leave, but they come back. It's not like people leave and permanently, are displaced from their land. So I think that the connection to the land keeps them grounded in that place. Even when they move away, they end up coming back also.
Maybe very, very brief comment from the Thai example. Very similar. Land has a very strong force on migration decisions, but also on return decisions. I think what is key here is how land is inherited and transferred to the next generation, whether this is subdivided among all children or one child gets the whole land. That changes the ability to make a living from land. And the second is, as we saw in Thailand, when we had, for example, in 2007-8, the financial crisis, 1997-98, the Asian crisis, where lots of people moved back from urban areas to rural areas because they lost jobs in precarious employment or precarious situations in urban areas, moved back to rural areas. And since that, this has ingrained it in rural people's or in rural to urban migrants' minds that never sell your piece of land, even as a small one, even if there's not a strong, I would say, spiritual bondage to land in the Thai society. It's a cultural thing. it makes tiness to have a piece of land, a water buffalo, and a bit of rice, even if this is totally unproductive in economic terms, but it's cultural. And if you lose your job in the urban areas, you still can survive on a very small piece of land doing a bit of rice, so you don't starve. So that keeps in. If you compare this to other places where you have a consolidation of land and a sinking number of farms and the increasing land size per farm, in Thailand this is pretty stable in the northeast. And the key reason is that people have made experience like better keep that. So you have a dual migration serves as a risk spreading system for rural places, but keeping land serves as a risk spreading system for the urban part of these translocal livelihood constellations.
Hello, thank you very much for your insightful presentations. I'm Limon Rodriguez from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS. So I have two questions. First, for Jan, what could be the plausible reasons for the statistically significant result for erosion and the not statistically significant result for floods? And my second question is for Sarah. I'm glad you talked about skills partnerships. As you know, like in the European Union, they're talking about European talent partnerships. Professor Michael Clemens, of whom I'm a student, is also like, he has this global skills partnerships, and IOM has this skills mobility partnerships. In your work in Africa, Sarah, are you seeing skills partnerships with countries in Africa that are more adversely affected by climate change?
Right. Thanks. I didn't have time in the presentation to talk about the floods and the non-significance. So one reason, again, is local context. So flooding in this river plain has a very important function for the livelihood of the riverine populations that depend on agriculture. And so flooding brings both humidity, but also nutrients. Only if flooding is too severe, so the water stays too long or rises too high, then it becomes dangerous for them and a problem. But those monsoon seasons that we have studied so far had normal level flooding or even too little flooding, which then counterintuitively at first, maybe people were actually worried that yields might be too low in the next year because there was too little flooding. Secondly, people can adapt to flooding more easily than to erosion, so they can raise their houses and they can raise the structures in the houses, etc. Thirdly, there are disaster relief programs for floods from the government level that are by now quite well established, which are not so much there for erosion. So I think there's a couple of context reasons that explain why we don't see this strong effect of flooding, but we see it for erosion.
On the skills partnership, I think so far what exists is mainly with like more middle income countries. So Tunisia, Morocco. I know there was some efforts with South Africa. I think for it to work with like really, like a Somalia or a Central African Republic or something, I think it would have to be much more of a stepwise process where you look at first kind of like, again, like what are the shorter, like the closer distance arrangements that could work. Because I do think like bridging probably from a background where people, have low levels maybe of alphabetization even to getting to like, I don't know, working in some factory in Germany might be a very big gap to bridge, right? But if you bridge that maybe first to a Ghana and then from a Ghana to Germany, or I don't know, but I think you'll have to think creatively about like what are the ways that different countries can be integrated into regional economies. Basically, at the end of the day, I think it's that.
If there are any more questions, this concludes the migration as adaptation or maladaptation session. I want to give a big applause to all of the speakers. Thank you for joining us and have a good rest of your day.